She scraped the kitchen hearth until her knuckles turned red. The scullery maid watched her from the doorway, holding a broom she never used. "That came for you," she said, nodding at the folded paper left on the edge of the wooden counter. The woman didn't look up. She kept working, the brush moving in small, hard circles, the kind that never left streaks. "It's not from the post," the maid added, a little softer now. "Just found it in the knocker." The woman rinsed her hands in the basin without a sound. The water turned cloudy. She dried them on her apron, turned to the counter and picked up the letter like it was something she'd dropped years ago and never thought she'd see again. She didn't open it. She slipped it inside the lining of her coat and walked past the girl, whose mouth twitched like she wanted to ask more but never would. In the hallway, the butler passed her without nodding. Upstairs, the bell rang twice. Lady Alderney. She didn't hurry. She never did. No one knew her age. No one knew her voice. 40 years and she'd never been invited upstairs. She folded the cleaning cloth in her pocket and began climbing, one hand on the rail, the other pressed gently to the hidden letter against her ribs. Lady Alderney opened the door herself. The old woman's hair was tied tight, her posture stiff, her eyes grey and unreadable. "You'll clean the windows," she said. The other maids had been dismissed last winter. The woman stepped inside, eyes on the glass panes streaked with dust. She didn't speak. She never did. She laid her tools on the floor and began to work, slow, precise, never pausing. At the far end of the room, a painting hung over the fireplace. It was the only portrait not covered with cloth. The woman glanced at it once. A man in military uniform. His eyes matched Lady Alderney's. She cleaned in silence, the sound of cloth against glass barely louder than breath. When the room was done, she turned to leave. "You knew him," Lady Alderney said behind her. The woman didn't stop. She only pulled a shawl tighter around her chest and stepped back into the hall, where no one ever asked questions and no one ever said her name. She carried the linen bucket past the nursery door and paused without reason. The door had been locked for years, yet today it hung open just enough to whisper. No footsteps, no voice, just stillness, like a held breath. She stepped inside, not out of curiosity, but because something expected her. The cradle sat empty. The drapes were drawn. Dust floated where sun never touched. She set the bucket down and wiped the chest of drawers first, always left to last, always skipped by the others. Inside the top drawer beneath a forgotten cloth, she found the wooden horse, one leg broken, painted blue, chipped at the ears. She turned it once in her hand, then twice, then held it still. No expression, no sound. She placed it carefully where it had sat before, though no one would know. From the doorway, the housekeeper cleared her throat. Lady Alderney asked for the guest room next. The brass has gone dull. The woman nodded without turning. The housekeeper lingered. Strange place to be, isn't it? That room. Always thought so. The woman picked up her bucket and walked out. Down the corridor, past the oil lamps and dust-soft rugs, her boots silent on old floorboards. She opened the guest room, laid out her tools, and began to polish the brass frame around the fireplace. 10 minutes passed before she noticed the letter had moved. It no longer pressed against her side. She reached into the lining of her coat and found it gone. The coat was unbuttoned. She remembered buttoning it. She searched the folds again, her fingers steady but deeper now. Nothing. The fireplace cast no shadow. She stood still. She'd told no one. She'd said nothing. The letter could not have moved, not on its own. She turned, picked up the brass rag, and worked until the reflection showed her face like it used to, quiet, tight around the eyes and aged without softness. She left the room with the rag still in hand. In the hallway, the butler looked up. "Your coat's open," he said. She buttoned it again without answering. No one saw her hands tremble. No one ever did. But something had shifted in the house, as if it had begun to remember before anyone else dared to. She replaced the broken teacup in the pantry without a sound. The cook wouldn't notice. It had already been chipped. She never broke things. That wasn't her way. From the pantry, she crossed to the drawing room, where dust lingered on the windowsill despite last week's polish. She worked the cloth in tight circles, her breath even, the rhythm steady. Behind her, the door creaked. The boy from the village stood there, the one hired last winter to stoke the fires. He looked younger than 16, but always wore his cap low to appear taller. "There's a frame missing," he said, pointing to the wall by the piano. She turned to look. The others were there. The Colonel, Lady Alderney's father, her brothers in uniform, all frowning in oil. But yes, a small space between two portraits sat bare, pale where sunlight hadn't touched the wall. The boy scratched his neck. "I saw it there yesterday. Black and white one. Looked newer than the rest." She didn't answer. He waited, then stepped back without pushing. She moved to the space and wiped it clean with the edge of her sleeve. The mark was faint, dust only, or memory. In the servants' stairwell behind the linen cart, the frame lay upright, leaning as if placed carefully. She lifted it, turned it over, and met her own eyes. Not young, not old, caught in a moment when her hair was darker and her mouth still hopeful. She held a mop in the photo. A boy stood behind her, about 6, perhaps 7, half smiling, wearing shoes too big and a coat that didn't match. She looked at it for a long time, then placed the frame face down beneath the cart. The boy with the firewood said nothing when she passed him in the corridor. She walked past the guest room, the nursery, the drawing room, her steps quiet, her hands dry. When she reached the south stairs, Lady Alderney stood waiting. "Did you take it down?" she asked. Her voice was calm, but colder now. The woman did not answer. "He was never yours to mourn," Lady Alderney added. The silence in the hallway thickened like paste. The woman turned, descended the stairs, and vanished into the servants' passageway without a sound. No one followed, no one ever had, but the space on the wall upstairs stayed empty all the same. She dusted the staircase rail with the soft brush, careful not to scrape the carved wood. The polish had worn thin over the years, the banister smooth where hands once passed but hadn't for some time. At the second-floor landing, she turned left instead of right. No one sent her there. That part of the house hadn't been mentioned in years. The door at the end was locked, as always, but the mirror beside it had shifted slightly, just enough to show a crack behind the frame. She reached behind it and felt the latch. The panel opened inward with a breath of air older than memory. No one followed. No one ever came to this side. The corridor was narrow and lined with linen-covered furniture. She walked past them without glancing, her feet silent even on the boards that creaked for others. At the final door, she paused. It opened with ease. Inside was a child's room, not the nursery. This one was simpler. A small bed, a wardrobe with one hinge loose, a writing desk with no chair. She didn't clean, she didn't move anything. On the bed lay a coat, the same as in the photograph. On the wall above it, a drawing, crooked and yellowed. 2 stick figures, one tall, one small. No words, no name. In the corner of the room stood a suitcase. She knelt beside it, undid the latches and lifted the lid. Inside were small boots wrapped in cloth and a pressed flower folded into paper. Nothing else. She closed it, fastened the latches and placed it back where it had sat. On her way out, she wiped the doorframe with her sleeve. At the landing, the scullery maid waited. "Lady Alderney's in the parlour," she said. "She's asking for the brass to be cleaned again." The woman nodded. She followed the corridor back through the mirror door and latched it behind her. In the parlour, Lady Alderney stared at the fire. "Did you think I wouldn't notice?" she asked. The woman began polishing the brass handle on the hearth. "That room was locked for a reason," Lady Alderney added, eyes never leaving the flame. The woman said nothing. She folded her cloth, tucked it under her arm, and turned toward the kitchen. Her eyes passed briefly over the bell cord that hadn't rung in 15 years. And yet now, as she walked away, it quivered once, without being pulled. She didn't look back when the bell cord moved. She never did. She placed the cloth in the pail, adjusted the iron latch on the cellar door, and stepped down slowly, 1 foot per stair, the way she had since before anyone living could recall. The cellar had no schedule, no task assigned, but she always went. Beneath the pantry and behind the wine racks, past the jarred peaches and the shelves of chalk-marked preserves, she stopped at the old boiler. A rusted chain hung beside it. She touched it briefly, then turned left, where a wall once stood, but no longer did. The space was empty now. The cot had been removed, the rug rolled up, the tiny bookshelf gone, but the light bulb still hung, a string pull dangling just above her head. She did not turn it on. She crouched and swept the floor gently, just fingertips, brushing dust into the corner. Behind a loose brick in the wall, she reached in and removed the folded cloth sack. From it she drew the letter, creased now, slightly smudged at the corners. She unfolded it slowly and read it again, her mouth still, her eyes dry. She returned it to the sack, replaced the brick, and stood without sound. Upstairs, footsteps passed quickly overhead, the sound of the maid's shoes, light, hurried, a knock, a raised voice, then quiet. She ascended the cellar stairs, wiping her hands on the apron that never left her waist. In the main hall, the butler stood with the post in his hand, uncertain. He didn't speak to her, but he didn't move aside either. After a moment, he offered the smallest of nods. She continued past him toward the upstairs parlour. The door was open. Lady Alderney sat with a letter in her lap, unopened. She stared out the window. "He didn't know," she said, not turning. "He was too young. I told him she'd gone to the coast." The woman stepped once into the room, then stopped. "And the child thought she never wanted him," Lady Alderney continued. "He cried for days. I remember that part." The woman didn't blink, didn't move. She simply reached behind her, closed the door with her fingertips, and waited. The letter in Lady Alderney's lap slid slowly to the floor. Neither of them bent to pick it up. She swept the parlour rug without glancing at the letter on the floor. Lady Alderney had left the room before breakfast, leaving her cup untouched and her cane against the armchair. No orders had been given, no bells had rung. The house moved slower that morning. Even the scullery maid's humming had stopped. In the corridor, the boy with the firewood waited beside the locked cabinet. "Do you know who he was?" he asked, his voice cracked halfway through. "The one in the photograph?" She didn't reply. He looked down at his boots. "He looks like me. That's all I meant." She turned and continued toward the west stairs. He didn't follow. She didn't need to ask. She had known since the day he arrived. He always stood a little too straight, always stared at the paintings like they were puzzles instead of ancestors. He'd once tied his boots with the same crooked knot. She entered the linen room and began folding the tablecloths no one used anymore. In the bottom drawer of the cabinet, under the moth sachets and unused tea towels, lay a boy's sketchbook, bound with twine, the pages uneven. She opened it gently. The first page held a name. Only one. A child's handwriting, misspelled. He had tried to remember. The sketches were crude, mostly stick figures and birds. A tree that looked like a cloud, a horse with one leg longer than the others, but halfway through, one page had more care. A woman, tall and bent at the shoulders, holding a mop, Her face was just lines, but the outline was unmistakable. She tore the page carefully, folded it in half, and placed it in her apron. The rest she left untouched. In the hall, the boy was gone. She returned to the drawing room. Lady Alderney stood beside the empty frame. "He'll ask eventually," she said. "Boys always do, and when he does, I won't answer." The woman walked past her toward the hearth and replaced the brass brush where it belonged. "I let them say you were a maid," Lady Alderney added. "But you weren't. Not really." The woman didn't turn. She reached into her apron, unfolded the drawing, and placed it on the mantel beside the matches. Then she left the room, silent as always, but with something unspoken folded now between them. Too late to change, too deep to erase. She entered the office just after the midday bell, though no one had rung it. The door was always left ajar now, ever since the steward stopped coming. Dust had gathered around the ledgers, but the ink remained sharp on the pages. She didn't sit. She opened the third drawer on the left, the one beneath the broken latch, and pulled out the household account book. It was heavier than it looked. Each line, a name. Each name, a wage. She ran her finger down 40 years' worth of lines until she reached the earliest pages. Names she remembered, barely. Cook, maid, scullery, porter. Hers wasn't there. She flipped the pages back, year by year, watching the paper grow newer, the ink darker. Her name never appeared, not once. Only cleaning services, written in the steward's square hand, with no signature and no address. She closed the ledger, placed it carefully back in the drawer, and folded the broken latch over the edge to hold it shut. In the corridor, the firewood boy was polishing the banister without being told. He stood when she passed. "I looked through the kitchen drawers," he said. "No papers, no letters, no records." She paused. He added, "I just wanted to know who you are." She walked past him without a word, but slower this time. He followed, a step behind. "Did she ever call you by your name?" he asked. She reached the end of the corridor and turned into the pantry. "Did anyone?" he called after her. The pantry door didn't close. She stood near the spice shelf, opened the tin labelled salt, and removed the folded paper inside. It wasn't the letter. It was older, more brittle. A certificate, handwritten. A birth, not hers. The name was the same as his. The mother's space was left blank. She placed it back inside the tin. When she turned, he was standing in the doorway. "Is that mine?" he asked. She handed him the tin without speaking. His fingers trembled slightly as he opened it. "Why hide it?" She reached out, gently closed the lid for him and returned it to the shelf. Then she picked up her bucket and cloth, walked past him and left him there, holding the weight of his own beginning. He didn't follow her this time, but he didn't leave the pantry either. She found the key beneath the third stair from the bottom, where the wood dipped slightly if you stepped just right. It had been there since the day she arrived. No one had told her where to find it. No one ever asked if she had. It was thin and iron, wrapped once with twine near the bow. She held it in her palm, the way one holds a coin meant to be returned. Then she slid it into her apron pocket and went back to polishing the drawing-room sconces. The boy stood by the hearth again. He had not lit the fire. "You were there the day I was born," he said, not a question. She wiped the brass slowly. "Was it here?" he asked. "In this house?" She didn't turn, and he nodded to himself. "That's why I remember your hands. They carried me." She folded the cloth and placed it on the mantel. "Why didn't you speak?" he asked. "Not once. Not even then." She reached into her pocket and handed him the key. He didn't understand at first. Then he looked toward the corridor, the locked room. "I thought that room was forgotten," he said. She walked past him, down the hallway, her steps slower now, as if waiting. He followed. At the end of the corridor, he inserted the key into the brass lock and turned it. The door opened with a soft sigh. Inside, the room was bare. Just a small bed, a chest, and a pair of child's boots too small to wear. The window was cracked open, though no one recalled ever opening it. She stepped inside and stood near the wall where the drawing once hung. He stood beside her. "Did you keep it for me?" he asked. She pointed to the chest. He opened it. Inside were pages, dozens of them, drawings, scribbles, a pressed flower, a wooden spoon, and at the bottom a card with his name, misspelled again in a child's hand. "I made this," he asked. She nodded once. He looked up. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" She met his eyes for the first time in years. The silence between them wasn't heavy now. It was whole. He didn't need her answer. He already knew it. She stood in the corridor long after he left the room. The door remained open behind her for the first time in decades. Dust didn't dare settle in the threshold. Downstairs, the housekeeper's voice echoed faintly, calling for linen. The woman didn't move. Lady Alderney stood at the far end of the hall, a cane in one hand, the other braced against the wall. "You gave him the key," she said. "It wasn't accusation, but fact." The woman said nothing. "He looks like his father," Lady Alderney added. "Not that the boy ever knew. Not truly." The cane clicked softly as she approached. "I told the staff you were hired. I paid you from my own purse, not the ledger. That way, no one asked questions." The woman met her gaze, steady. "I didn't know at first," Lady Alderney continued. "Not until he drew your face over and over on the nursery walls." She exhaled slowly, not out of regret, but exhaustion. "You didn't speak. I thought that meant consent." The woman reached into her apron and removed a folded paper, stained from years of handling. She held it out. Lady Alderney took it with shaking fingers. It was a receipt, dated 4 decades prior, payment for care, not wages, not services, just one word beside the sum. "Quiet." Lady Alderney lowered the paper. "You could have left." The woman nodded. "You could have taken him." She shook her head. "Then why stay?" The woman lifted her hand, placed it gently on the wall between them, and pressed her palm flat against the wallpaper, as though touching something buried inside it. Her eyes never left Lady Alderney's. "Because this house remembered him," Lady Alderney whispered, "and so did you." The woman turned, walked down the stairs, and passed the drawing room without pause. The boy stood outside, holding the tin that once hid his name. "Was she cruel to you?" he asked. She shook her head. "Did you forgive her?" Her lips parted for the first time in 40 years, but no sound emerged. Instead, she took his hand, placed it over the tin, and closed his fingers around it. The bells in the parlour rang once. Neither of them turned back. She rose before the sun and washed her hands in the scullery basin for the last time. The soap had worn thin, the towel frayed, but her fingers moved with their usual care. In the pantry, she opened the salt tin and removed the certificate. This time, she didn't return it. She folded it once more, slid it inside the envelope from the knocker, still unopened, and sealed it shut with a pressed edge. On the outside, she wrote nothing, no name, no address, only a single line in faded ink. "Give this to him when I've gone." She placed it on the kitchen table and stepped into the corridor where the morning light had only just begun to reach. She moved without her bucket, her cloth, her apron. Only her coat remained, buttoned up to the collar. Lady Alderney stood at the bottom of the staircase, one hand resting on the rail. "You won't stay?" she asked. The woman shook her head. "The boy, he wants to know everything," Lady Alderney added, "but I won't be the one to tell him." The woman reached into her pocket and withdrew a second envelope. She held it out. Lady Alderney took it. Inside was a photograph. 2 figures, one adult, one child, both smiling. The woman turned and opened the front door herself. The manor didn't creak behind her. No wind followed, no one called out. She crossed the path without a glance back, her boots tracing the same steps they had for 40 years, only slower now and without pause. At the gate, the boy waited. He didn't speak, he simply opened it. She passed through. He held out the tin, but she placed her hand over his and gently pushed it back toward him. "Will I ever see you again?" he asked. She looked him in the eye and nodded. Not yes, not no. Just enough. Then she turned down the lane where the fields were already waking and vanished between the hedgerows like someone returning to a place no one remembered. The boy stood at the gate for a long time, the envelope in one hand, the tin in the other. He didn't cry, but when he turned back to the house, he stopped before the door and whispered her name. And for the first time, the house seemed to whisper it back.